الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر
Hi and welcome to Worlds Apart, a program that is committed to speaking the truth in love. I'm your host, Rommel Gussain, and today we have with us Jay Smith, who will be speaking to us about ideologies that are worlds apart. Welcome to the show, Jay.
Hey, it's great to be here, Rommel.
It's always a pleasure to have you come and speak to us. Now, last episode we were able to speak about God coming down and dying for us, but we did not ask the question why. And I think that's the fundamental question that we need to ask. Why did this happen? Why did he do that?
I think when we stopped, we were referring to this very fact, the fact that Muslims always ask us how. How could God become a man? How could God die? And we were very firm that we don't question this. You don't ever ask God how he can do it. Of course God can become a man. That is so simple. And it's an affront to God to even suggest that he can't become something that we are. It's an affront to suggest that he couldn't die and rise again. That's an affront to God. The question they should have asked is why. That's the better question. That's the real question, and that's what we want to answer today. Because the assumption is that if God were to come to earth and then take on human form, Jesus was the name that he took while he was on earth, those 33 years, and he died, that would assume maybe that God is weak or that God is incapable of not only protecting his. We talked about that in a former episode. But the real something is there must be a reason, because God just wouldn't do this. And I hear Muslims always say to me, why is that so important? Why did God need to come down then and become a man? Why couldn't he just forgive him? God can do anything. In fact, they'll throw it right back in my lap. Say, you're the one that's saying God can do everything. Certainly God can do anything. Then why didn't he just forgive them? Because that's exactly what the Quran implies, that God forgave Adam and Eve. And that was it. End of story, Mr. Smith. But they don't read the rest of the story. They need to read on in Surah 7, because he didn't just forgive them. If he just forgave them, then why did he throw them out of the garden? Why is it that he threw them from that garden, which was up in space, down to earth?
To earth, yes.
And I've never heard a Muslim that can give me an answer. To understand that, they need to come back to our Bible. They need to come back to the scriptures. They need to come back to that story in the Bible. Muslims don't have an answer for that. And when Muslims don't have an answer, they're told over and over again in Surah 1094, we've done this before, Surah 21, Ayah 7, Surah 29, Ayah 46, Surah 4, Ayah 136, Surah 5, 46 and 47, and verse 68. And over again, they're told, if you have any question, come back to the Tawrat, come back to the Injil, come back to the Al-Kitab, come back to us, and come back to our scriptures. Because the answer is right here. The answer is right through Scripture, and it's probably one of the most important questions for Muslims to ask, because they will not understand what we're talking about. They will not even understand the mission of Jesus, the mission of God that took on bodily form, unless they go back to the very beginning. And you have to start at the very beginning. You've got to start the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden in Genesis 2 and 3 is very clear. That's on earth. That's not up in space, like the Quran confuses. It's not up in space. It's on earth. What's more, in that garden, God is. That's hugely significant. In fact, that's probably the most significant thing between these two scriptures. The Quran suggests God is not in that garden. In fact, nowhere does it even intimate that Allah ever came to that garden, even though it's up in space. In this one, it's very clear God is in that garden. In verse 8 and 9 of chapter 3, it said he is walking and talking. He is walking in the cool of the day. That means he had legs. He is talking, calling out to Adam and Eve, where are you? So what that says about my God immediately is that my God comes down to my level. He limits himself. He enters time and space. He's walking in the garden. He's calling out for Adam and Eve, where are you? Now, why did he need to call out, where are you? He knew where they were. God knows everything, does he not?
Of course.
Why do you think he was calling out, where are you?
Please tell me.
He wanted a response. He wanted, this God limits himself. This God comes down to earth. This God walks, and this God wants a response. Can you see? We're talking about almost two different gods here.
Yes.
The God in this book is not able to come to earth. The God in this book cannot walk and talk. That God in this book always demands a response from way up in heaven, and the response of submission, so the response is obedience. This God comes down to our level. This God comes and incarnates himself amongst us. And at the very beginning, God did incarnate himself. That was a perfect environment. Look at chapter 2 of Genesis, and you will see there were no thorns, there were no thistles, there were no childbirth pains. Man was naming the beast. There was a perfect relationship between man and beast. Man and woman were naked. They knew nothing was wrong. Perfect relationship between man and woman. There was, because of the fact that there was none of these imperfections in the natural world, there was a perfect relationship between man and his natural kingdom. And most importantly, God and man were walking and talking in the cool of the day. There was a perfect relationship between man and God.
Wow.
And this was something that was done by the fact that he was in the cool of the day. This happens every day. It was an ongoing relationship. This God is relational God. This God comes down to our level. This God limits himself, comes amongst us, and he has a relationship with us. At the very beginning, that was the case.
So you've never really shown to us that what God had intended for in the beginning, what he had created, we are so far from that.
Okay, now why?
Why?
Exactly. Now, that's where you need to go the rest of the story. And though the Quran does intimate that, the Quran does not understand it. God said very clearly, he said, there is a tree that you must not eat of. God was seeing if man would be obedient. Man did eat of it. Man and woman, they both ate of it. That destroyed that disobedience. And once that happened, look and see what happens in chapter 3. Immediately, everything was impaired. And this is where Muslims need to read. They need to realize that everything was destroyed. Now man no longer can name the beast. Now he must kill the beast to have food, which means his environment was completely changed. Now there were thorns. Now there were thistles. Now women had childbirth pains. Now man had to work the ground to get his food. So everything was destroyed. Man and woman, they looked at each other. They were naked. They knew something was wrong. Now they had to clothe themselves because that beautiful relationship between man and woman was also impaired. And most importantly, and this is where Muslims need to realize this, God threw man out of his presence. That relationship that had been perfect, where man and God could walk and talk face to face in the same environment, had to be destroyed.
God didn't accept it.
Cannot. Why could he not accept
He
it?
didn't just flippantly forgive them.
No. And what's the reason? Do you know the reason?
No, please tell me.
Great. You need to go back to the Bible again. The Bible gives the answer right there. In Habakkuk chapter 1 verse 13, it says very clearly that God cannot look upon sin. God cannot look upon sin.
Wow.
It's so clear. That shows the holiness of God. He is so holy that he cannot even have one sin in his presence. Remember, Adam and Eve only sinned once. Just one sin, one episode of disobedience. And God had to throw them out of his presence. That's how holy God is. And that's how serious sin is. So Muslims have no idea what they're talking about when they say simply God can forgive them. They have no idea what went wrong because they have no idea what was there. They don't know what was really there in the Garden of Eden. They have no idea what paradise was. Paradise was a place where God and man were together, walking and talking in the cool of the day. Because that's not in the Quran, they're completely missing that fact. No wonder they don't understand what we're talking about. They have no idea of the heinousness of sin. Sin has destroyed that relationship. Sin has destroyed everything. It's much like I give you a beaker of glass right now. If I were to give it to you and I asked you to drink it, you'd drink it no problem.
That's right.
What if I put one drop of arsenic into that?
No
Remember,
way.
It's clear.
It'll kill me.
Yes, but you wouldn't see it.
Yeah, I can't see it now.
No. You'd still not drink it, would you not?
Yeah,
But it's
if you
only
told
one
me.
drop.
That's right.
Can you see what one drop does to the entire beaker? It corrupts the entire beaker, and that's what sin has done. Sin is just like that one drop of arsenic. It completely corrupted all of creation. It corrupted everything, every relationship between man and woman, between man and the beast, between man and his environment, and most importantly, between man and God. And we only see that in the Bible. The Bible tells us exactly what went wrong, which means everything was destroyed, which means, as we well know, that the wages of sin is death.
Yes.
We know that not only the New Testament says that, but Leviticus is very clear on that their death comes about from sin, which means everything was destroyed, and that's where death entered the
So the
creation.
reason why we die is what?
Because of sin.
Because of sin.
Death entered the world. Now be careful. Let's be careful what we mean by death.
Yes.
Physical death existed.
Okay.
And will continue to exist. Physical death is different. What we're talking about here is spiritual death. Because listen, they continued to live after that. Adam and Eve, even down after they're thrown out, they continued to live. They didn't die physically. This is a spiritual death. That destruction, that rupture between man and God. That was a death that was permanent. And as we know in the Bible, it's very clear what it was going to take. And this is why you have to go read the Bible. It's very clear. God then gives the parameters of what it's going to take to come back, to get back in relationship. If we want to get back walking and talking with God again, something's going to happen. We're going to all have to die, but there's going to have to be an atonement. Now, this is where Muslims don't understand, and Muslims, listen to me very carefully. Nowhere in the Quran does it talk about atonement.
Nowhere.
Nowhere. In fact, they don't understand because they have no idea of the heinousness of sin. In the Quran, all it says is basically you have to work off your salvation by doing good deeds, good deeds, good deeds. The angel sitting on your right shoulder records these good deeds. These are called barakah, and it records over and over again your good deeds. On the left shoulder, when you're born, an angel is then placed on your left shoulder. It's invisible, you can't see him, and he's recording your bad deeds. And when you die, according to Islam, these good and bad deeds, the records, are put on a scale, and hopefully your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds. If that is the case, and only if that is the case, you were given the opportunity to cross a razor-sharp bridge, which is called the Sirat, over into paradise, under which is, at the bottom of which is hell. And as you're crossing over that razor-sharp bridge, hopefully trying to get over to paradise, Allah can throw you down at any time and you go down to hell. Wow. So no Muslim has an assurance of salvation.
Wow.
Did you know that?
No.
But you do.
Yes.
Why? The reason you do, because the Bible is very clear.
Yes.
Right there in the same scenario, when he condemns Adam and Eve, in verse 15, he turns towards Eve and he says to Eve, from your line, someone, he, that means it's going to be a man. He, third person singular, masculine. He is going to come and crush the head of Satan, and Satan's going to bruise his heel. That's the solution right there. Someone's going to come who's going to be in the line of Eve. Therefore, it has to come in the line of a woman. It has to come in a woman's line, and it's going to be a man, not a woman. It's going to be a male. And his function is to crush the head of Satan. Now, why is that? Well, you need to go back to Leviticus 17, which is very clear. In Leviticus 17, you have what atonement's all about. And it says very clearly, let me just read it for you because it's so clear in the Bible.
Do, yes.
In Leviticus 17, when you look at verse 11, for the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make an atonement for yourself on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life.
That's very clear.
Leviticus 17:11 is very clear. It is the atonement that is needed to get back in relationship to God, and that atonement is going to have to be a life. A life has to be given. Blood has to be shed. That is very clear. And 79 times throughout the Old Testament, it talks about atonement over and over and over again. This is a recurrent theme all the way through the Old Testament. And when did it all begin? When did that atonement begin? So where was that all prefigured?
In Genesis.
Well, actually, you're right. It's in Genesis. And Muslims, you need to listen to this because the whole atonement was prefigured in the sacrificial system. The sacrifice was the beginning of the prefigurement that pointed to that atonement.
Was it an invention of Paul?
No, it wasn't an invention of Paul.
Was it something that was only in the New Testament?
No, it's not.
It's actually found in the Old Testament.
It's in Genesis 15.
Wow.
In fact, Muslims, listen to me, because you still are sacrificing and you believe you need a sacrifice. Every Muslim that's listening to me here, you know you have to continue sacrificing, but you have no idea why you're sacrificing. Now, if I ask you, why are you sacrificing? You'll say, because Allah has demanded it. Why did Allah demand it? Because Abraham had to do it. Why did Abraham have to do it? You need to go back to that story. You don't have that story in the Quran. You don't know where it all began. You need to come back to Genesis 15. In Genesis 15, the whole creation of the sacrificial system absolutely shows us everything of what's going on. There in Genesis 15, God tells Abraham to set up a covenant. Now, a covenant between God and man is going to be a universal covenant that God sets up and starts with Abraham. And he tells Abraham to get 3 animals and 3 birds. Remember that?
That's right.
Now, that's a covenantal system that Abraham knew about because it comes out of Mesopotamia. It comes out of the Euphrates Valley where Abraham came from. So God was using a covenantal, basically a covenantal guidelines that Abraham was already familiar with. This is something Abraham would have done with any covenant. So Abraham said, yes, okay. So he went and got 3 animals, got 3 birds, killed them, split them in 2 on the rock. Killed them and split them in 2 on the rock. And then Abraham knew that both parties had to walk through between the blood of those sacrificed animals and birds. And in walking through, they then sealed the covenant. It was a blood covenant, exactly what Leviticus 17 demands. It must be life-given. Now stop and ask yourself, do you remember what happened when Abraham split those animals on the rock? What did God do next?
Yes. Abraham slept. He put him to bed.
But Abraham didn't sleep. God put him to sleep.
Yes, that's right.
Oh, I love it.
A deep sleep.
He put him to deep sleep. And then who went through between the animals and the birds?
God.
God uniquely went through as a fiery brand. He would not let Abraham go through this. This is the whole initiation of the covenantal system of sacrifice. The whole sacrificial system was based on that covenant. But that was a covenant that only God could fulfill. God was telling us and was telling Abraham, you cannot fulfill this covenant. This is not for you. This covenant only I can do. This is only something God can do. Why? Because it has to be he who is sinned against, who must therefore take on that punishment.
Only God can forgive, only God can save.
Absolutely. This is
Makes
only
sense.
capable. Otherwise, if that were the case, I could just die and I would fulfill the covenant. But dying doesn't do it.
That's right.
My death, my blood doesn't not fulfill it, because it's God that was sinned against, not me. God therefore had to take on that sin.
He was offended.
And that's why Genesis 15 is so important for Muslims to go back to. The whole sacrificial system was predicated on this event.
Wow.
That it would be God that would do this. That's why every sacrifice after that was always pointing to that event. Muslims, remember, you're told that whenever you sacrifice, you're to get a perfect goat, an unblemished goat. Why is it you're supposed to do that? I know what you're going to tell me. It's because Abraham did it. Well, where do you think Abraham was why do you think Abraham was told to get unblemished goat? Because it's the perfect sacrifice, the unblemished sacrifice, which means that the final sacrifice would have to be a perfect what? Well, we know from Genesis 3, verse 15, that it was going to be someone from the line of Eve who would be whom? A perfect sacrifice. Let's go and jump to Isaiah. There's so many other verses we could go to. Let's just go to Isaiah 7:14.
Okay, yes.
Because there Isaiah really gives us and pinpoints who this is going to be. And he says, this will be the sign. This will be the sign that predicates who this sacrifice is. All the way through Scripture, you see key after key after key after key as to who this sacrifice is. He's going to be called the Messiah. The Messiah is the anointed one. Why? To save. To save, that's what atonement does. It saves you. So therefore, it will be the Messiah that does that. So we know already the Messiah has to be the anointed. Only God can save, so therefore the Messiah has to be God. He will be called the Son of God, because he would have everything that God has, so would he have. So Isaiah said, this will be the sign. A virgin will conceive. Now, wake up, Muslims. You know that virgins don't conceive. You know that virgins don't conceive. It's impossible, medically impossible. So when a virgin conceives, this is the sign. A virgin will conceive and have a son. Not a woman, not a girl, but a boy. Going back to Genesis 3:15, that's exactly what God promised Eve. There will be someone who comes through your line. He, and would be asking, would come. And what is Isaiah? A virgin will conceive and bear a son, and he shall be called Emmanuel. God with us.
Wow.
This son, this answer to everything that God had set up would come through a virgin. That's how we know to identify him. And he would be God with us.
Wow, God dwelling with us.
There you go.
Amazing.
You can't get more specific.
But hang on, we made a shift here. There was these animal sacrifices, but then you pointed it all to Jesus.
Oh, right,
Well,
because
why did God require animal sacrifices?
Well, because until Jesus came, the sacrifices were there to point to that event,
Okay.
and not to take over, and not that they would incorporate the sacrifice. They were nothing there to remind the people, to point the people to the final sacrifice.
The animals could do nothing.
No, they could do nothing. They could not take on that, because they're just animals. Any more than you could do nothing. Any more than
Exactly.
anybody could do nothing. If that were the case, then Adam and Eve would just have to ask forgiveness to get back up into the Garden of Eden again. Because all they did was one sin. Why didn't they just ask forgiveness and go back home again? The fact that they could not go home is because God is so holy that they could not come into that holy presence. In order for them to come into that holy presence, death had to be given, a sacrifice had to be shed, life, blood had to be spilt, and that could only be God's blood.
That makes sense.
Now,
Perfect sense.
Can you then understand why God had to come in the form of a man?
Yes, absolutely.
To fulfill all those prophecies, and that he would come, and that we would have to know when he would come, when a virgin conceives. Now, Muslims, let me ask you, you know that virgins don't conceive, but is there one case where a virgin did conceive? Do you know of any virgin that has conceived? Every Muslim listening today knows the answer to that question, because it's in your Quran. It's in Surah 19, Ayah 20. In Surah 19, Ayah 20, it's very clear that only one virgin in the history of mankind has ever conceived, and her name is Miriam. Ooh, I love it. This is not my authority, but it's your authority. And even your Quran gets it right. Miriam, the mother of Jesus, conceived. And who was God with us? Well, we know who God with us is. When a virgin conceived, that son is going to be God with us, Emmanuel. The name that is given to him on earth is called Jesus, because that's his function. Jesus is one who saves. That's where the Messiah comes from. He is the anointed one, the one to save, the anointed to save. That Jesus, the Christ, is the other name that's given to him in Greek, is the one that has been promised. So that's why he had to come, because it was promised from the very beginning. That it would come through a virgin, it would come through a woman in Eve's line, and that when he would come for what function? He would come to save. And the only way that could happen is there had to be a life given. There had to be blood shed. Leviticus 17, verse 11 is very clear. Life has to be given. Blood has to be shed. Jesus is the only one who fulfills every one of those. And that's why when you look at Isaiah 53, when you look at Psalm 22, when you look at Isaiah 69, when you look at Micah 5:2, verse after verse in the Old Testament, all pointing to where he would be born. Micah 5:2 in Bethlehem, the fact that he would be the Messiah who would come and take on our stripes. Isaiah 53, the fact that he would die and then he would live, rise again and be victorious. Isaiah 69, the fact that that we are to kiss the Son lest he be angry, the Son of whom? God himself in Psalm 2. And the fact that you go through all these scriptures, you will see they're all pointing to that enactment. They're all pointing to that Messiah who would come as God. It had to be God who took on human form. Not only because it had to be God who died, but he had to come in the form of a man to take on all the capacity of man. Now, the question is, can God become a man? We've already answered that one.
Yes.
How does that make sense? Is he a little bit God? Is he a little bit man? Is he 50-50? No. He's 100% man and 100% God. Now, how do I explain that? Probably the best way to explain that is what I call the quality-quantity argument. I'm an American. I'm here in Australia. While I'm in Australia, I'm not as much of an American, am I not?
That's right.
I'm not eating hamburgers like I would in America. I'm not breathing the air. I don't know the sports scores. So quantitatively, I'm less of an American living here, am I not?
That's right. You're living like an Australian.
That's right, thank you. Which is pretty good, actually. I have to admit, I love this country. But coming here, you can see quantitatively, I have limited myself. Qualitatively, am I any less than American?
No.
Absolutely. I'm still 100% American. And that's somewhat of what we're getting at. That's what God is. When God became a man, quantitatively, it says there in Philippians 2, verse 6 through 11, he, Jesus, who did not consider equality with God, something to be grasped, took on himself the form of a man. Humbled himself. Oh, I love that. Humbled himself.
Wow.
And took on the form of a man. The form of a servant, in fact, is what it says in the NIV. To the point of dying for us. Ooh, it's so clear. It's all right there in Philippians 2. He limited himself. Quantitatively, he became less of God, yes. And for that period, for 33 years, quantitatively, he didn't know the end of times. And when Muslims always say, how can he be God if he doesn't know the end of times? He says, why do you pray to me? Why do you call me good? Only God is good? Well, that's a rhetorical question. In fact, what it's really saying is, if you really believe I'm God, then you realize, if you really believe I'm good, then you mean you're calling me God. I and the Father are one, he says over and over again. So you can see there is qualitatively, he is still God, but quantitatively, he limited himself. Otherwise, we wouldn't understand what was happening when he was up on the temple and he was being tried by Satan. How could that be a trial if he wasn't completely human? So he took on all the limitations of being human. That means all the limitations of understanding the future or even knowing the end of times. Yet qualitatively, he was still 100% God. Can I explain that? No. As there's many things that are mysteries, there's no way I could explain it in my human understanding.
This might sound like a real silly response, or even a question, I should say. Why did he have to become a man? Why couldn't he just become a creature, anything else? Why a man?
Because he promised that at the very beginning. In Genesis 3:15, on your line, he would come. He had to take on human form because it was humans who had rejected him. It was Adam and Eve who were humans that rejected him. Therefore, he had to take on their punishment by being them. He had to come in human likeness.
He took on their nature, but apart from sin, as you were saying before.
Sinless.
Yes.
So qualitatively, he was sinless. Quantitatively, he was on earth. Qualitatively, he never gave up his divine. Any more than quantitatively, I'm less of an American, but qualitatively, I'm 100% American living here in Australia.
Okay, hang on a sec. We understand. So he died?
He absolutely
He
did.
died. He died for everybody.
But he didn't stay dead. And that's why it could only be God who could eradicate all of sin. The comprehensiveness had to be only God could do. The humanity was the fact that he was taking on human sin. That he was doing that he was taking our place. So therefore he had to be human.
Okay, but he died. He died for everybody.
Everybody.
So isn't that universal salvation? Isn't everybody
Did you
saved?
hear that,
then?
Muslims? Are you listening to this? He died for you. Everybody listening here, he died for. We don't have to wait till we go across that bridge. We don't have to work off our salvation. It's already been done. You don't need a sacrifice. Sacrifice has already come.
But is the Muslim saved?
The Muslim is not saved until they understand that, until they accept that death and resurrection.
Until they receive it.
Until they receive it. That's all you need to do. That's all it takes. And then they're saved. Just like that.
So there's nothing they can do.
Not a thing they can do. It's already been done for them.
If you pray more,
Can't
if
do
you
it.
worship God
Listen,
more,
Adam and Eve only did one
if you
sin, and
fast
they couldn't
more,
get back into heaven.
if you give more,
Not a thing.
if you help poor people,
That's how holy God is.
Wow.
How dare we think we can get back in God's presence?
That's amazing.
God's done it for us.
Thank you very much. Once again, it's always a pleasure to have you here and to share some of your insights with us. It's amazing. If I can just turn to our audience and say to them once again, I'm sure that you have been challenged by what was spoken. If you're a Christian, please check these things out for yourself. Perhaps you haven't heard these things explained the same way that they were explained now. You need to know these things. You need to understand these things. How do you expect to speak to your neighbor, whether Muslim, Hindu, or whoever, and explain these things to them if you don't understand them yourself? My Muslim brothers and sisters, I love you. We love you. I pray that you would check out these things for yourself from the scriptures. Jay's been able to express these things to us with advantage by citing the Quran itself, but always going back to the scriptures and showing that the answer is there. The question of why it's there, it makes so much more sense if you go back to the Holy Scriptures. I pray that you have found this episode to be informative. Please stay in tune for the very next episode, and may God bless you. Thank you.